Hi children, good morning each and everyone. Dear children, today we'll start with a new chapter, that is vectors. Dear children, in this chapter we'll be learning the basic concepts of vector, representation of a vector, that is how to represent the vector, then position vector of a point with respect to origin, types of vectors, direction ratios and direction quotients of a vector, algebra of vectors, that is addition or subtraction or scalar multiplication of a vector, then components of a vector, that is vector components or scalar components. And the last one, the product of two vectors by using a cross product or dot product, by using a cross or and dot product. The children will study one by one. So here usually the study of vectors, is generally known as vector analysis. The study of vectors is known as vector analysis. In 19th century, there is an American mathematician called Gibbs. He developed this vectors for the first time systematically. Andre ಈ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ಸನ್ನು ಸಿಸ್ಟಮ್ಯಾಟಿಕಲಿ ಯಾರು ಡೆವಲಪ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದ ಅಂದರೆ ಅಮೇರಿಕನ್ ಮ್ಯಾಥಮೆಟಿಷಿಯನ್ ಕಾಲ್ಡ್ ಗಿಬ್ಸ್ ಡೆವಲಪ್ಡ್ ದಿಸ್ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ಸ್ ಫಾರ್ ದ ಫಸ್ಟ್ ಟೈಮ್ ಸಿಸ್ಟಮ್ಯಾಟಿಕಲಿ. ಓಕೆ, ರಿಮೆಂಬರ್ ದಿಸ್ ಡಿಯರ್ ಚಿಲ್ಡ್ರನ್ಸ್. ದೆನ್ ವಾಟ್ ಡು ಯು ಮೀನ್ ಬೈ vector? So before that we'll see what is a scalar. Usually there are two physical quantities. One we have scalar and another we have vector. There are two physical quantities. One is called scalar and the other is called vector. Then what do you mean by scalar? For example, consider the weight of a duster. It is a weight. Okay, just weight. It has only weight. Okay, for example, the length of the duster. We have length. Length of this duster, or just consider the length and width of this board. Usually such a quantities are called as scalar. They have only magnitude, that is a quantity. Which has only magnitude are called scalar. Usually scalar is a real number. Remember again, what is scalar? Scalar is a quantity which has only magnitude. Only a magnitude are called as scalar. Usually the scalar is a real number. Okay, for example, weight, length. Think very simple example. Height of a human body. It has, for example, 5 feet or 5 feet, 5 centimeters or 1 meter, 1.5 meters. We have only magnitude, that is 1.5 or 5 or 5 feet. For example, 5 feet. It is what? It is only a magnitude. Then such a thing are called as scalar. Then we have vector. Then what do you mean by vector? It is a quantity which has both magnitude and direction. Any quantity which has both magnitude as well as direction, then such a thing is called as what? Vector. A vector is a quantity having both magnitude and direction is known as vector. For example, force or velocity, acceleration, so on. For example, think there is a block. Okay, I'll move the block from this side. Okay, then the block moves towards this side, right? It will be like this. We are applying force, but the block is moving towards that side. Okay, here we have both force, that is direction as well as magnitude. Okay, for example, if I move from this side, this block moves towards this side, right? So here we have force as well as direction. Okay, then such a thing are called as vectors. Dear children, very simple example. Okay, now ಹೇಳ್ತಿರ್ತೇವೆ, the car is moving at the rate of 20 kilometers per second towards east or towards north or towards south. So their speed as well as direction, then usually the such a thing are called as what? Vectors. ಅಂದರೆ ಯಾವುದೇ ಒಂದು ಕ್ವಾಂಟಿಟಿಗೆ ಮ್ಯಾಗ್ನಿಟ್ಯೂಡು ಪ್ಲಸ್ ಡೈರೆಕ್ಷನ್ ಇತ್ತು ಅಂದರೆ ಅದನ್ನು ನಾವೇನಂತ ಕರಿತೀವಿ ಜನರಲ್ ಆಗಿ? ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ಸ್. ಓಕೆ, ಫಾರ್ ಎಕ್ಸಾಂಪಲ್, ನಾನು ಒಂದು ಬ್ಲಾಕ್ ಇರುತ್ತೆ, ಅದನ್ನು ಮೂವ್ ಮಾಡ್ತೀವಿ ಫ್ರಮ್ ಲೆಫ್ಟ್ ಟು ರೈಟ್ ಆರ್ ರೈಟ್ ಟು ಲೆಫ್ಟ್. ಓಕೆ, ಮೂವಿಂಗ್ ಡಿಸ್ಪ್ಲೇಸ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ. ಸೊ ಆ ಡಿಸ್ಪ್ಲೇಸ್ಮೆಂಟನ್ನು ನಾವೇನು ಕರಿಬೇಕು ಜನರಲ್ ಆಗಿ? ಓಕೆ, change of direction. Okay, then that is totally is known as what? Vectors. Okay, dear children, again, so what is the difference between scalar and vector? It is a quantity which has only magnitude. It is a quantity which has only magnitude. For example, weight of this tester, length of this tester, for example 15 centimeter, that is 15 centimeter is what? Magnitude. Okay, or that usually this is called as what? A real number. A scalar is a real number. Again, a scalar, a quantity which has only magnitude is known as scalar. So scalar once again is a real number. Example, height, weight, length, something. Then what is vector? A quantity which has both, or quantity having both magnitude as well as direction is known as a vector. For example, force, velocity, acceleration, and so on. Okay, you should remember this. What is the difference between scalar and a vector? Next we have a representation of a vector, that is how to represent a vector. So usually the vectors are represented by a directed line segment, okay. So here I'll write A and this point is what? B. So here, so dear children, generally it is a line segment. It is a directed line segment having direction from A to B. Whereas this is only a line segment. It has no direction. Okay. Therefore, what is generally the vectors are represented by a directed line segment, or this can be written as B. Okay. Now again the direction is from A to B, or this can also be written as again this is a directed line segment from where to where? B to A, not A to B. The direction is from B to A. Okay. Therefore here AB is a directed line segment representing a vector. So AB is a directed line segment which represents a vector. Usually they are denoted by AB bar. Read or simply we'll write it as A bar. While read it as vector AB or simply vector A. So read this as vector AB and this as vector A, or will simply read it as AB bar, or this is A bar. Again children, here, so this point is known as initial point, and this point is known as terminal point. That is the starting point is known as initial point and the end point is known as terminal point. You should remember this is initial point and this is terminal point. Okay, here what is initial point? So this is initial point, and what is terminal point? So this is terminal point. That is B is the initial point and A is the terminal point. Here A is the initial point and B is the terminal point. Then the length between A and B, or the distance between A and B, the length of AB, or distance between A and B. The length of AB or the distance between the point A and B is called as or is known as magnitude. Again, ಈ ಲೆಂತ್ನ ನಾವೇನಂತ ಕರಿತೀವಿ ಅಥವಾ ಡಿಸ್ಟೆನ್ಸ್ ಬಿಟ್ವೀನ್ ಎ ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಬಿನ ಒಟ್ಟಿಗೆ ಏನಂತ ಕರಿತೀವಿ ಅಂದರೆ ಮ್ಯಾಗ್ನಿಟ್ಯೂಡ್. ಎಂತ ಕರಿಬೇಕು? ಮ್ಯಾಗ್ನಿಟ್ಯೂಡ್. ದ ಲೆಂತ್ ಆರ್ ದ ಡಿಸ್ಟೆನ್ಸ್ ಬಿಟ್ವೀನ್ ದ 2 ಪಾಯಿಂಟ್ಸ್ ಈಸ್ ನೌನ್ ಆಸ್ magnitude. Generally they are denoted by magnitude of vector AB, or this can be written as magnitude of vector A, or you can read it as modulus of vector AB or modulus of vector A. So generally we will read it as magnitude of AB bar, A bar. So what is magnitude of AB bar? It is the distance or length between the 2 points, so length of a vector. Again, how to represent a vector? Usually the vectors are represented by a directed line segment. Okay, here AB is a directed line segment which represents a vector. Here A is called initial point and B is called terminal point. Usually the length between the length of AB or the distance between A and B is known as a magnitude of a vector, which is denoted by magnitude of vector AB or magnitude of vector A. Here again consider, here the length between B and A. Now we will write this as what? BA, vector BA, vector BA, not vector AB. Andre starting point and the initial point and the terminal point ಗೆ ಓದಬೇಕು, ರೀಡ್ ಮಾಡಬೇಕು. So that is B to A, not A to B. Okay. So now this is represented as what? BA bar. Okay. Don't write like this. Okay. That is AB bar. So AB bar becomes this one. Okay. So now this can be written as what? BA bar. You know what is the magnitude? That is magnitude of BA bar. Okay. ಹಂಗಂತ ಹೇಳ್ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಸರ್ ಡೈರೆಕ್ಷನ್ನು ಈ ಥರ ಇದೆ ಸರ್, ಡೋಂಟ್ ರೈಟ್ ಲೈಕ್ ದಿಸ್ ಬಿ ಎ. ಓಕೆ. ಸೊ ಡೈರೆಕ್ಷನ್ ಈಸ್ ಫ್ರಮ್ ವೇರ್? ಬಿ ಟು ಎ. ಇದು ಡೈರೆಕ್ಷನ್ ಇದೆ ಎ ಟು ಬಿ. ಸೊ ಇದೇನಾಯ್ತು ಡೈರೆಕ್ಷನ್ ಎ ಟು ಬಿ ಆಗಿಬಿಡುತ್ತೆ. ಫಾರ್ ಯು ವೋಂಟ್ ರೈಟ್ ಲೈಕ್ ದಿಸ್, ವಿಲ್ ರೈಟ್ ಎ ಟು ಬಿ, ದಿಸ್ ಇಸ್ ಲೈಕ್ ದಿಸ್. ಓಕೆ, ರಿಮೆಂಬರ್ ದಿಸ್. ಓಕೆ. ಸೊ ಹೌ ಟು ರೆಪ್ರೆಸೆಂಟ್ ಎ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್? ಸೊ ಇಟ್ ಈಸ್ ಎ ಡೈರೆಕ್ಟೆಡ್ ಲೈನ್ segment. Okay. Next we have types of vectors. We'll see the types of vectors. First we have types of vectors. So first one we have zero vector, or it is also called as a null vector. A vector having a zero magnitude is known as zero vector or null vector. Usually they are denoted by vector 0. Again, a vector having. Next we have types of vectors. We'll study the types of vectors. Firstly we have zero vector, or it is also called as null vector. Then what do you mean by zero or null vector? A vector whose magnitude is 0. Whose magnitude is 0. ಯಾವುದೇ ಒಂದು ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ನ ಮ್ಯಾಗ್ನಿಟ್ಯೂಡ್ 0 ಆಗಿತ್ತು ಅಂದರೆ then such a vectors are called as zero vectors or null vectors. Usually these zero vectors are denoted by vector 0. Here for zero vectors, that is initial point and terminal point coincides. Initial point ಮತ್ತು terminal point ಏನಂತೆ coincides ಆಗುತ್ತೆ. ಅಂದರೆ ಇದೇ initial point ಆಗುತ್ತೆ, ಇದೇ terminal point ಆಗುತ್ತೆ. So therefore where is the length? There is no length. Therefore what is the magnitude of this vector? 0. Therefore such a vectors are called as zero vectors. Usually the zero vectors are represented as, that is AA, vector AA, or vector BB, or vector CC, which has same initial point and terminal point. Initial point, terminal point. Usually the zero vectors are represented as vector AA, vector BB, vector CC. We have same initial and same terminal point. Okay. Next, second one we have unit vector. Then what do you mean by unit vector? A vector whose magnitude is unity, that is one unit is known as unit vector. A vector whose magnitude is unity, that is one unit, is known as a unit vector. Okay, next, third one, we have equal vectors. Then what do you mean by equal vectors? Two or more vectors are said to be equal if and only if they have same magnitude and direction. Two or more vectors are said to be equal if and only if they have same magnitude and direction. Example, direction from A to B. Okay, and again here direction from C to D. So I'll represent this as A bar and I'll represent this as B bar. So now these two vectors have same magnitude and in the same direction. Therefore such a vectors are called as equal vectors. ಯಾವುದೇ ಟೂ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ಸನ್ನು ಈಕ್ವಲ್ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ಸ್ ಅಂತ ಯಾವಾಗ ಹೇಳ್ತೀವಿ ಅಂದರೆ ಅದರ ಮ್ಯಾಗ್ನಿಟ್ಯೂಡು ಅಂದರೆ ಲೆಂತು ಮತ್ತು ಡೈರೆಕ್ಷನ್ನು ಸೇಮ್ ಇದ್ದರೆ ನಾವೇನಂತ ಕರಿಬೇಕು? ಈಕ್ವಲ್ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ಸ್. ಆರ್ ಆಲ್ ರೈಟ್ ಲೈಕ್ ದಿಸ್. A bar, this is B bar. Okay, now these two vectors are equal vectors because they have same magnitude and the same direction. Okay, next we have like and unlike vectors. Like and unlike vectors. See, then what do you mean by like and unlike vectors? Vectors having same direction. Vectors having the same direction. Here, the magnitude doesn't matter. Magnitude doesn't matter. See that the vectors must be what? The same direction. That is. See, so vector A, vector B. Vector A and vector B are in the same direction. Therefore such a vectors are called as like vectors. That's vectors are called as like. These are called as what? Like vectors. Like vectors. Vectors having opposite in direction. Vectors having opposite in direction. Then such a vectors are called as unlike vectors. For example, so that is vector A, vector B. Now vector A and vector B are unlike vectors. Unlike. So they have same. They have opposite direction. They have opposite direction. Here A vector A and vector B are in the same direction, but magnitude is different. Here vector A and vector B are in opposite direction. Therefore these vectors are called as like vectors and these vectors are called as unlike vectors. Vectors having same direction. Again children, remember, ನಾವಿಲ್ಲಿ ಮ್ಯಾಗ್ನಿಟ್ಯೂಡ್ ಅನ್ನು ಕನ್ಸಿಡರ್ ಮಾಡಲ್ಲ, ಬರೀ ಡೈರೆಕ್ಷನ್ ಮಾತ್ರ. ಸೇಮ್ ಡೈರೆಕ್ಷನ್ ಇತ್ತು ಅಂದರೆ ಅವನೆಂತ ಕರಿಬೇಕು? ಲೈಕ್ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ಸ್. ಆಪೋಸಿಟ್ ಡೈರೆಕ್ಷನ್ ಏನು ಕರಿಬೇಕು? ಅನ್ಲೈಕ್ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ಸ್. ಹಾಗಾದರೆ ಸರ್ ಸೇಮ್ ಮ್ಯಾಗ್ನಿಟ್ಯೂಡ್ ಇರ್ಬೋದಾ? ಇರ್ಬೋದು. ಓಕೆ, ಫಾರ್ ಎಕ್ಸಾಂಪಲ್ ಈ ಥರ ಇತ್ತು ಅಂದರೂ ಕೂಡ ಇದನ್ನು ನಾವು ಏನು ಕರಿಬೋದು? ಲೈಕ್ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ಸ್. ಇದನ್ನು ಏನು ಕರಿಬೋದು ಬೇಕಾರೆ? ಅನ್ಲೈಕ್ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ಸ್. ಸೇಮ್ ಡೈರೆಕ್ಷನ್ ಇದೆ, ಲೈಕ್ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ಸು. ಆಪೋಸಿಟ್ ಡೈರೆಕ್ಷನ್ಸ್ ಇದೆ, ದೇರ್ ಫೋರ್ ದರ್ ಕಾಲ್ಡ್ ಆಸ್ ವಾಟ್? ಅನ್ಲೈಕ್ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ಸ್. ಓಕೆ, ರಿಮೆಂಬರ್. ಹಾಗಾದರೆ ಕ್ಯಾನ್ ವಿ ಕಾಲ್ ದಿಸ್ A vector and B vector has a like vectors? Definitely. Okay, these are what? Like vectors. Next one we have co-initial vectors. Co-initial vectors. See, as the name indicates, two or more vectors having same initial point, then such a vectors are called as co-initial vectors. Two or more vectors having same initial point, then such a vectors are called as co-initial vectors. For example, so I'll write vector A, again I'll write another vector B, okay, I'll write another vector C, any number of vectors. Okay, I'll write another vector here D. Okay, so now vector A, vector B, vector C, vector D are called as what? Co-initial vectors having same initial point. Two or more vectors ge same initial point ittu andre ಆ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ಸ್ ನಾವು ಏನು ಕರಿಬೇಕು ಈಗ? co-initial vectors. Next we have collinear vectors. Then what do you mean by collinear vectors? The vectors which are parallel to each other or parallel to same line. The vectors which are parallel to each other or parallel to same line, that is two or more vectors parallel to each other or parallel to same line. Okay, for example, so these are called as what? Collinear vectors parallel to each other. Here magnitude and direction doesn't matters. Okay, with so are these are called parallel vectors. Again ಇದು ಕೂಡ parallel vectors. So magnitude ಮತ್ತೆ direction ಏನು ಬೇಕಾಗಿರಬಹುದು, but see that they are parallel to each other, but this and this are not parallel vectors. This is not parallel vectors because they are not parallel to each other. Usually two or more vectors which are parallel to each other are known as collinear vectors. Next we have coplanar vectors. Two or more vectors lying in the same plane, in a same plane. So this is important. Two or more vectors lying on the same plane. For example, consider the plane. That is, I'll write here one vector, that is A bar, and I'll write another vector, that is vector B. Okay, and I'll write another vector here C, vector C. Now vector A, vector B and vector C are coplanar vectors. Very simple example. What is a coplanar vector? It means the vector two or more vectors lying on the same plane. For example, consider the plane board. I'll write one vector here, that is vector A. I'll write another vector here, that is vector B. I'll write another vector here, that is vector C. Now vector A, vector B and vector C are lying on the same plane. Therefore these vectors are called as coplanar vectors. Two or more vectors lying on the same plane or parallel planes, or we may have another plane. I'll write for example A bar, B bar, C bar. I'll write another vector here somewhere on the top of this. Okay, then such a vectors are called as coplanar vectors. Simple definition: two or more vectors lying on the same plane is known as coplanar vectors. Next one we have negative of a vector. So this is important. Negative of a vector. Negative of a vector. So then what do you mean by negative of a vector? A vector having same magnitude of that of a given vector but opposite in direction to that of it is known as negative of a vector. A vector having same magnitude to that of a given vector but opposite in direction. Same magnitude irutte but opposite and direction ittu andre then such a vector is known as what? Negative of a vector. Vector having same magnitude but opposite in direction. For example, vector having same magnitude, alright, here a bar which has the same magnitude, okay, already b bar. So now, a bar is a negative of b vector, or b vector is a negative of a vector, generally written as a vector is equal to minus vector b, or if you write like this, that is a b. So that is a b, vector a b is equals to minus ba. So this is highlight again a b minus vector ba. So again, negative of vector, a vector having same magnitude but opposite in direction is known as negative of a vector. Should have a same magnitude but opposite in direction, okay. Okay children, we have types of vectors. One, we have a zero or null vector. A vector having zero magnitude is known as zero vector, usually denoted by vector 0 bar. Okay, symbolically related as that is magnitude of a bar is equal to 0. So ಯಾವುದೇ vector na, if a bar is a vector, if a is a vector, then ಅದರ ಮ್ಯಾಗ್ನಿಟ್ಯೂಡ್ ಏನಾದರೂ 0 ಆಯಿತು ಅಂದರೆ ದೆನ್ ವಿ ಕಾಲ್ ದಿಸ್ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ ಹ್ಯಾಸ್ ಝೀರೋ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್. ಓಕೆ ಚಿಲ್ಡ್ರನ್ಸ್, ಅಗೈನ್ ಇಫ್ ಎ ಇಸ್ ಎ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ ದೆನ್ ಮ್ಯಾಗ್ನಿಟ್ಯೂಡ್ ಆಫ್ ಎ ಬಾರ್ ಇಸ್ ಈಕ್ವಲ್ ಟು 0 ಆಯಿತು ಅಂದರೆ ದೆನ್ ವಿ ಕಾಲ್ ದಿಸ್ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ ಆಸ್ ವಾಟ್? ಝೀರೋ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್. ನೆಕ್ಸ್ಟ್ ಸೆಕೆಂಡ್ ಒನ್ ವಿ ಹ್ಯಾವ್ ಯೂನಿಟ್ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್. ಎ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ ಹೂಸ್ ಮ್ಯಾಗ್ನಿಟ್ಯೂಡ್ ಈಸ್ unity, that is 1 unit, 1 centimeter, okay, like that. A vector having the vector whose magnitude is unity, okay, is known as what? Unit vector. Usually unit vector in the direction of a vector a bar, unit vector in the direction of vector a bar is denoted as a cap. A unit vector in the direction of the vector a is denoted as a cap. Here a cap means it is a unit vector. So generally here for unit vector, magnitude of a bar is equals to 1. We should remember this. Symbolically the unit vector is written as magnitude of a bar is equal to 1. If a is a vector, ಅದರ ಮ್ಯಾಗ್ನಿಟ್ಯೂಡ್ ಏನಾದರೂ 1 ಆಯಿತು ಅಂದರೆ ದೆನ್ ವಿ ಕಾಲ್ ದಿಸ್ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ ಹ್ಯಾಸ್ ಅ ಯೂನಿಟ್ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್. ಸರಿ, ಈಗ ಈ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ ಯಾವಾಗ ಯೂನಿಟ್ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ ಅಂದರೆ ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ನಾವು ಮಾಡಲೆಸ್ ಅಪ್ಲೈ ಮಾಡಿದಾಗ ಅದರ ವ್ಯಾಲ್ಯೂ 1 ಬಂತು ಅಂದರೆ ದೆನ್ ವಿ ಕಾಲ್ ದಟ್ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ ಹ್ಯಾಸ್ ಯೂನಿಟ್ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್. ಓಕೆ, ಎನಿ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ ಇಸ್ ಸೆಡ್ ಟು ಬಿ ಯೂನಿಟ್ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ ಇಫ್ ಇಟ್ಸ್ ಮ್ಯಾಗ್ನಿಟ್ಯೂಡ್ ಈಸ್ ಈಕ್ವಲ್ ಟು 1. ನೆಕ್ಸ್ಟ್ we have equal vectors. Two or more vectors are said to be equal if and only if they have same magnitude and direction. For example, here vector a and vector b are equal vectors, that is they have same magnitude and same direction. Okay, next we have like and unlike vectors. Vector having same direction, vector having same direction. Dear children, remember, like vectors ಗೆ magnitude ಸೇಮ್ ಇರಬೇಕು ಅಂತಿಲ್ಲ, ಡೈರೆಕ್ಷನ್ ಹೆಂಗಿರಬೇಕು, ಸೇಮ್ ಇರಬೇಕು. magnitude doesn't matter here. Okay, vectors having same direction are called as like vectors. Again, the vectors opposite direction are called as what? Unlike vectors. So direction is the opposite ಇದೆ, ಇಲ್ಲೂ ಅಷ್ಟೇ. So magnitude doesn't matter, right? Next we have co-initial vectors. See, as the name indicates, co-initial. Okay, that means two or more vectors having same initial point. Here vector A, vector B, vector D and vector C having the same initial point, same initial point. These such vectors are called as co-initial vectors. Next we have collinear vectors. Two or more vectors which are parallel to each other are known as collinear vectors irrespective of magnitude, irrespective of magnitude. Okay, and direction, ಅಂದರೆ ಕೊಲಿನಿಯರ್ ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ಸ್ ಹಿಂಗಿರಬೇಕು, ಪ್ಯಾರಲಲ್ ಆಗಿರಬೇಕು, ಅದರ ಡೈರೆಕ್ಷನ್ ಯಾವ ಕಡೆ ಬೇಕಾದ್ರೆ ಇರ್ಬೋದು, ಮತ್ತು ಮ್ಯಾಗ್ನಿಟ್ಯೂಡ್ ಬೇಕಾದ್ರೆ ಡಿಫರ್ ಇರ್ಬೋದು. ಸೊ ಹಿಯರ್ ದಿಸ್ ಟು ವೆಕ್ಟರ್ಸ್ ಆರ್ collinear, these two vectors are collinear, again these two vectors are collinear, which is having opposite direction, the magnitude is different, here having same direction. Okay, so two or more vectors are said to be collinear vectors if they are parallel to each other, parallel to same line, irrespective of magnitude and direction. Next we have coplanar vectors. Coplanar vectors, two or more vectors lying on the same plane, that is known as coplanar vectors. Here for example, consider the plane. Here I have vector A, vector B, vector C are lying on the same plane, therefore they are called as what? Coplanar vectors. Coplanar vectors. Again, for example, consider, I'll take a board of this, I'll write two vectors here, vector A and vector B. Okay, I'll write two vectors, vector A and here vector B. I'll write vector C here. Then here vector A, vector B, vector C are coplanar vectors. Vectors, very simple definition, two or more vectors lying on the same plane or parallel plane are known as coplanar vectors. Next we have negative of a vector. Negative of a vector, a vector having same magnitude but opposite in direction to a given vector is known as negative of a vector. For example, they must have same magnitude but opposite in direction. Consider vector AB and vector here BA are in have same magnitude but opposite in direction. Therefore, vector AB is equal to minus vector BA, or generally A bar is equal to minus B bar. So this is what? Negative of a vector. Negative of a vector. Okay, dear children, just remember this. Okay, so remaining that is next we have a position vector of a point. We will see that in the next class. Thank you.